In the summer of 1980, four women of faith vanished from the quiet hills of Northern Oregon. They left no note, no clues, no cries for help, only questions that hardened with time. Now, nearly 3 decades later, on the anniversary of their disappearance, the man who had spent his life searching for answers stood once again before the altar. The early light streamed through the stained glass windows of Holy Grace Parish, painting slow-moving shapes on the pews. Father Daniel Cross lifted his hand, in blessing, his voice steady but heavy with remembrance. May the souls of the departed, through the mercy of God, rest in peace. Amen, the congregation replied as one. Daniel lowered his hand and scanned the faces before him, many lined with age, some still young enough to be spared the weight of memory. These were the faithful of Fairhaven Ridge, a town that once trembled under the mystery of 4 missing nuns. That tremble had become a quiet ache woven into the fabric of the community, like a scar under the skin. As the final hymn faded into silence, Father Daniel stepped down from the altar and moved toward the rear entrance, where he greeted each parishioner with a kind word and a practiced smile. Most offered gentle nods and murmured sympathies. Some had been children back then, too young to grasp what had happened. Others, like Mrs. Annabel Harmon, had carried the grief as long as he had. I remember Sister Margaret so well, she said, her voice caught between fondness and sorrow. She taught my twins their prayers. Such a warm presence. Daniel pressed her hands with both of his, nodding. She was kindness itself, he replied softly. Sister Margaret Doyle had been 70 when she disappeared. Alongside her were Sister Helen Whitmore, 67, Sister Alma Rivera, 29, and the youngest of them all, Sister Lillian Cross, just 24. The last name was the one that still lodged in Daniel's throat, the one that never passed his lips without the risk of tears. Lillian was not just another name in the parish record. She had been his little sister. When the church finally emptied and the final echoes of footsteps faded, Father Daniel made his way back to his private office behind the sanctuary. The room was quiet, lit by a narrow window overlooking the small cemetery out back. The scent of polished wood and old incense clung to the air. He shut the door behind him and sat down heavily at his desk. For a long moment he simply stared at the wall, breathing in the silence he so rarely allowed himself to feel. His hand reached for the drawer at his side. From it he drew a small wooden box worn along the edges. Inside were photographs. He lifted the top one, Lillian smiling under her veil on the day of her final vows. She had been radiant that day, eyes full of hope, her hand tight around a simple wooden rosary. I was so proud of you, he whispered. I still am. But as always, that thought came with a shadow. If he hadn't nurtured her devotion, encouraged her path to religious life, would she have chosen another way? Would she be married now, teaching music in Portland? Still alive. He made the sign of the cross, sharply driving the thought from his mind. Another photo lay beneath, the last image ever taken of the 4 women together. They sat on a weathered bench outside a small white chapel, St. Bridget's, surrounded by the towering pines of the Silver Pine Wilderness. Sister Margaret and Sister Helen, calm and composed. Sister Alma with her usual quiet poise, and Lillian, her posture, upright eyes, brimming with resolve. The photo had been taken by a passerby just days before they vanished. The nuns had traveled to the remote chapel for a spiritual retreat and were tasked with assessing the condition of the old building. Daniel could still hear Lillian's voice from those days. The chapel is beautiful, she'd said. A little tired but full of peace. I want to help restore it if they'll let us. But they never came home. Search parties combed the forest for weeks. Helicopters scanned the treetops. Dogs sniffed through brush and creek beds. Nothing. Not a footprint, not a shred of cloth. Official reports later suggested a wildlife attack. Black bears were known in the area, but there was no blood, no signs of a struggle, just absence, like the forest had swallowed them whole. The rumor mill had not been kind. Some whispered that the younger sisters had run off, that maybe it was a coordinated escape from the strictness of religious life. Others speculated darker things, cults, mental breaks, secret pregnancies. Daniel had fought every version, especially the ones that painted Lillian as unfaithful. She had been devoted. He would stake his soul on that. He looked again at the chapel in the background of the photo. It had stood since the 1920s, a lonely beacon for scattered Catholic families deep in the woods. He hadn't seen it in over 20 years. The pain had been too sharp. But now on this day, something pulled at him, a quiet ache that pressed against his chest. Maybe it was only grief surfacing again, or maybe he was being called to look once more. He tucked the photo into his pocket, rose from his desk, and retrieved his Bible and rosary. With a silent prayer, he stepped out of the rectory and into the parking lot, the morning air sharp and clean. He got into his car, placed the photo on the seat beside him, and started the engine. The road to Silver Pine was familiar in the way old wounds were familiar. It wound through farmland, past long-abandoned barns, and then into the wild tangle of evergreens that marked the edge of the wilderness. He remembered driving this same road in 1980, plastering missing person flyers at every rest stop, praying with strangers, hoping for a miracle. Today he carried no flyers, only memory. An hour later, as the trees thickened and the road narrowed, Daniel searched for the old dirt path that once led to St. Bridget's. But what he found was not the turnoff he remembered. Instead, a wide private drive had been paved over the old route, flanked by stone pillars and a black iron gate. A polished sign read, "Private property, no trespassing." He pulled to the side of the road confused. He checked the photograph again, comparing the tree line and distant hills. Yes, this was the place. But where was the chapel? He got out of the car and approached the gate on foot. Beyond it, a winding lane disappeared into the woods lined with carefully arranged shrubs and imported pines. There was no sign of the small white chapel, only manicured land and silence. Frowning, he took out his phone. There was one man who might still know something: Thomas Reeve, the caretaker who had once tended to St. Bridget's. He tapped the number and listened to the ring. "Hello," came a gravelly voice. "Thomas, it's Father Daniel Cross, from Holy Grace." There was a pause, then warmth. "Father Cross, well, I'll be. It's been a long time." Daniel's voice tightened. "I'm standing outside what used to be the turnoff to St. Bridget's. But it's gone, Thomas. The chapel is gone." A silence heavier this time. "Yes, Father," Thomas finally said. "They sold it, years ago. Some private buyer. Victor Langford, he tore it down. Built a house back there, I think." Daniel's breath caught. "I never knew. No one told me." "I don't think many people did," Thomas admitted. "Not after what happened. The diocese didn't want reminders lingering." Daniel stood still as the wind moved through the trees. Something cold crept into his bones, not just grief, but something else. A faint whisper in the back of his mind. Something's still there. Father Daniel remained by the gate for a long moment after ending the call. A brisk breeze stirred the pine needles along the roadside, the air sharp with the scent of resin and memory. He tried to imagine the chapel standing there again, white paint flaking under the weight of years, its small bell tower rising modestly above the treetops. But all he could see now was a trimmed lawn, rows of ornamental shrubs, and an impassable iron gate. He climbed back into his car, the photograph still resting on the passenger seat. Lillian's face smiled up at him, so young, so assured. He touched the image with 2 fingers and whispered a quiet prayer. Then he started the car and pulled away from the gate, unsure of where to go next, but unwilling to return to Fairhaven Ridge just yet. The road curved along the edge of the forest, and as he drove, his thoughts wandered. He remembered the days after the disappearance, with painful clarity, standing beside volunteers at the ranger station, holding up maps, drawing circles around likely search zones, coordinating prayer vigils that felt more like funerals. The sheriff had done what he could given the lack of evidence, but the leads had dried up almost immediately. No broken windows, no forced doors, just 4 women who walked into the forest and were never seen again. Daniel's foot eased off the gas as he neared a bend in the road, where a narrow overlook offered a glimpse back toward the property. Through the trees, the space where the chapel had once stood was visible, a clearing now carefully landscaped and disturbingly pristine. He slowed to a stop on the shoulder and turned off the ignition. For a while he sat in silence, watching nothing. Then it happened. From the stillness of the car, a sound emerged, soft at first, barely audible, like a distant murmur carried on wind. But it was coming from inside the car. From the radio. The problem was, the radio was off. He distinctly remembered turning it off before leaving the parish. And yet now it was alive again, emitting something strange and haunting. Not static, not a voice. Music. Chanting. Low echoing tones, a melody he hadn't heard in decades. Latin syllables sung in a pattern he instantly recognized. It was the Salve Regina, ancient, monastic, sung every night by the sisters during Compline. Daniel's breath caught. The sound continued for several seconds, then faded suddenly completely. The radio remained off the dial unchanged. No lights, no signal, no explanation. He sat motionless for a long time, the chant echoing in his memory long after the last note had vanished. A trick of the mind, perhaps. Stress, exhaustion. That's what he told himself. But the feeling remained the same strange stirring he'd felt in his office earlier. A sensation not unlike prayer or calling. He reached for the ignition but stopped. His eyes turned again toward the clearing through the trees. And then, for reasons he couldn't fully explain, he opened the car door and stepped out. The roadside sloped downward toward the forest's edge, and he moved carefully along the embankment, shoes crunching against fallen needles. The trees here were old, tall, and tightly spaced, forming a natural curtain around the property. He stayed close to the fence line, following it as it curved around the perimeter. The wrought iron stretched on, sturdy and unwelcoming, but here and there the ground dipped or rose in uneven angles. He rounded a shallow hillock, scanning for anything, any remnant of the old chapel, any sign the land still remembered what had once stood here. Then his foot caught on something, a root half buried. His balance shifted. He stumbled forward, arms outstretched, catching himself against the fence. The metal rattled under his weight. He froze. The section he had fallen into tilted oddly. There was a metallic groan, and then with a jolt, one of the panels popped loose at the base. It shifted open just enough to reveal a gap wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Daniel stared at it, stunned. He hadn't meant to damage anything, but now here was an opening, a clear path inside. He looked behind him. The road was empty. No one had seen. The property was private. He knew that. But what if... He stepped back, pulled the loosened panel farther aside, and ducked through the gap. On the other side, the silence deepened. It was a cultivated quiet, the kind found in expensive gardens and manicured estates. No bird song, just wind and faint rustling in distant branches. He moved slowly across the clearing, where the chapel had once stood, now replaced by decorative trees and foreign plants. Nothing remained. No plaque, no stone, no sign that anything sacred had ever stood here. Daniel closed his eyes, trying to recall the chapel's layout. The bench from the photo had stood near a broad oak, if memory served. That tree was gone now, but behind it had been a cluster of tall pines. He turned toward that direction. He walked further into the landscaping skirting beds of blooming azaleas and curiously shaped hedges. Then he saw a glint of metal half concealed beneath a fan of ornamental grass. He knelt, parting the branches carefully. A grate, square, rusted, set into the ground like a drain, but older, heavier. Its design didn't match the aesthetic of the rest of the property. It bore small scroll-like patterns on the edges, something not seen in modern fixtures. He leaned closer and heard it. Ihum. Faint, melodic. His skin prickled. Then a cough. A human cough. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. He bent lower, bringing his ear close to the grate. The humming continued, low and rhythmic, then cut off abruptly. Another cough followed, wetter, weaker. He shot upright, breath caught in his throat. Someone was down there. Not a ghost, not memory. Someone. He looked around wildly. Still no sign of movement. No cameras. No alarm. The main house was far enough away, obscured by a patch of trees and terrain. The spot he had reached was deep within the property, well beyond any easy line of sight. Hands trembling, he pulled out his phone. He dialed 3 numbers. 911, what's your emergency? This is Father Daniel Cross, he said quickly, from Holy Grace Parish in Fairhaven Ridge. I'm at the private property of Victor Langford near the former site of St. Bridget's Chapel. He stopped. How did one explain this? I believe someone is underground. I can hear a woman, humming, coughing, through a grate in the ground. Silence. Sir, are you saying someone may be trapped? I don't know, but someone is down there. I heard it clearly. Are you legally on the property? Daniel hesitated. Not exactly. I fell against the fence. Part of it came loose. I stepped through. I know I shouldn't be here, but this seemed urgent. Understood. We're dispatching officers. Please remain on site, but move to a public location if you feel unsafe. I'll wait near my car, Daniel said, eyes still locked on the rusted grate. But please hurry. He ended the call and backed away, casting one last glance at the spot where sound had risen from the earth. His mind swirled with questions, but one thing was clear: someone was alive beneath the place where the chapel had once stood. And after 28 years, that changed everything. Father Daniel waited by the side of the road, just out of sight from the estate's gate, pacing back and forth as he kept one eye on the empty drive and the other on his phone. He could still hear the faint broken hum playing on a loop in his memory, each note laced with something far more chilling than any ghost story. This was real. Someone was alive under that earth, and someone else had buried them there. After a few minutes, Daniel scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he needed, Thomas Reeve. His thumb hovered for a second before he hit call. It rang 4 times before the familiar gravelly voice answered. "Hello. Thomas, it's Father Daniel again." "Something wrong, Father." Daniel looked back toward the forest, as if the grate might vanish the moment he blinked. "I'm still near the old chapel grounds. I found something." A pause. "What kind of something?" "There's a vent in the ground. Old iron half covered by shrubs. I heard something coming from it. A voice chanting, then coughing." Another pause, longer this time. "Are you certain?" "I'm not imagining this, Thomas." The caretaker exhaled through the receiver. "Well, that's the thing, Father. There wasn't any vent there when I looked after the place. No basement, no sublevels, nothing below ground. St. Bridget's was built straight onto a slab foundation. I would have known if there'd been anything like that." Daniel's grip tightened around the phone. "Then someone built it after the sale." Thomas sounded uneasy. "That'd be a hell of a thing to hide. You can't dig out a chamber without equipment, and people notice equipment. Unless it was done slowly, quietly, over time, or after dark." Silence again. Then Thomas's voice returned lower and more urgent. "Where are you now?" "Near the main road outside the gate." "I still live close by. Not 15 minutes from where you are. I saved a few things from the chapel after it was decommissioned. Prayer books, the altar cross. You're welcome to come take a look." Daniel hesitated. "I appreciate that truly. But first I need to try speaking with the current owner, Victor Langford. He may know what's under the ground." Thomas didn't respond right away. Langford's not exactly neighborly, Father. Keeps to himself. Doesn't mix much with anyone. I'd be careful. He's not fond of surprises. "I'll be polite." "I didn't say you wouldn't be. I said he's not fond of them." Daniel thanked him for the warning, ended the call, and climbed back into his car. As he drove slowly down the road, he pulled up the GPS map. According to Thomas, there was a secondary road that looped around the backside of the estate, public access, not gated. It might take him close enough to the main house without trespassing again. 20 minutes later, he found himself navigating a narrow road lined with dense trees and deep shadows. Through brief openings in the woods, he glimpsed glimpses of the Langford estate, a sprawling, stone and timber home perched like a fortress on a hill. The building stood 3 stories high with oversized windows that glinted in the waning afternoon light. It looked more like a luxury lodge than a private residence, and it felt wildly out of place among the rustic simplicity of the surrounding wilderness. He parked beside what appeared to be a side entrance, adjusted his clerical collar, and stepped out onto a flagstone path lined with neat hedges. The quiet here was different, unnatural, manicured. The air itself seemed subdued. As he neared the main entrance, a heavy wooden door swung open before he could knock. A tall man stood in the threshold, lean and broad-shouldered, wearing designer sportswear and holding a leather dog leash in one hand. His hair was silver-cut close to his head, and his face was carved into a permanent scowl. "Yes," he said, voice-clipped eyes scanning the collar before settling on Daniel's face with disdain. "Good afternoon," Daniel said evenly. "Are you Mr. Langford?" "I am, and you're trespassing." "I apologize. My name is Father Daniel Cross. I serve Holy Grace Parish in Fairhaven Ridge." He extended his hand. Langford didn't take it. "What do you want?" he asked, fingers tightening slightly on the leash. "I was hoping for a moment of your time. I recently visited the site of the former St. Bridget's Chapel. I didn't know it had been demolished." Langford's mouth curled. "If you saw it's gone, what's there to talk about?" Daniel kept his tone calm. "I spoke with Thomas Reeve, the former caretaker. He mentioned you purchased the land after the chapel was closed." Langford took a step forward. "So, I just hope to understand what happened to it. The chapel held significance to many of us, especially me." Langford's gaze was cold. "It was an old building on cheap land. I bought it, tore it down. You want a sermon about history? Save it. The place was falling apart." Daniel stood his ground. "I understand, but it meant something. My sister—" He paused, recalibrated. "One of the nuns who went missing in 1980 was my family." Langford's face didn't change. "I remember the story. People said they wandered into the forest, got eaten by a bear." Daniel didn't flinch. "You don't believe that, do you?" I believe what makes sense, Langford said sharply, and what makes sense is they left or got lost. End of story. No mystery, no conspiracy, just nature doing what nature does. He turned to go. Now, if you don't mind, I'd appreciate you getting off my property before I call the sheriff. Daniel took one last shot. Mr. Langford, when you tore down the chapel, did you notice anything underground? Anything strange beneath the foundation? Langford turned back, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he gave a dismissive wave. It was solid stone. Nothing down there but dirt. We leveled it, paved it, landscaped it. That's it. No air vents. A drain, maybe, Langford replied curtly. Something for runoff. Nothing important. Daniel looked him in the eye. Drains don't hum hymns. Langford's jaw clenched. Goodbye, Father. He stepped inside and shut the door without another word. Daniel stood there for several long seconds, watching the door as if it might open again. But it didn't. The silence returned thick and stifling. He walked back toward his car slowly, the weight of the conversation settling over him like a lead vest. Langford hadn't just been dismissive, he'd been hostile. Rattled even. And though he hadn't admitted anything, there had been a flicker, a hesitation too quick to miss when Daniel had mentioned something underground. That flicker was enough. He climbed into the car, gripped the wheel, and whispered to himself, "You know something. You're hiding it." He glanced once more at the estate through the trees. And something deep in his bones told him that the worst was yet to come. Father Daniel drove back toward the public road in silence, his fingers tapping restlessly against the steering wheel. The encounter with Victor Langford had left him more unsettled than before, not because of what the man had said, but because of what he hadn't. Langford had denied everything, of course, but it was the way he denied it too fast, too sharp, too rehearsed. Like someone who had spent years preparing for the wrong question. Daniel reached the bend in the road again, the one that offered a partial view of the old chapel grounds. He pulled over without thinking, his eyes drawn once more to the empty clearing framed by pines. The ornamental landscaping looked serene on the surface, but now it felt like a disguise, a mask laid carefully over something far older and far more sinister. He sat there for a while, unsure of what he was hoping to find. Then, just as he was about to turn the key in the ignition and head back to Thomas Reeves' place, the radio flared to life. It wasn't music, it wasn't news. It was the same sound he had heard earlier, but clearer now, stronger chanting. Ancient, echoing, unmistakable. Latin voices rising and falling, in solemn harmony, weaving a melody older than the nation they sang within. The Agnus Dei, if he wasn't mistaken. Daniel stared at the console. The radio was off. The power light wasn't on. The dial was at 0. The volume knob hadn't moved. And yet the chant played on, vibrating softly through the cabin of the car, as if the vehicle itself had become some kind of instrument. He reached out slowly and turned the knob. Nothing changed. The sound continued. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped, cut off mid-note, leaving only the hush of wind and engine ticks in its place. Daniel sat frozen for several seconds. He wasn't a man easily swayed by theatrics. His faith was firm but grounded. He believed in miracles but not coincidences. And this felt like neither. It felt like something trying to speak to him, something that had waited years to be heard. He opened the door and stepped out into the fading light. The forest was quiet. No birdsong, no footsteps, no signs of movement. He walked to the edge of the trees where the land sloped down slightly toward the landscaped clearing. The wrought iron fence still stood looping around the property like a barrier between the living and the long forgotten. Daniel followed it again, retracing his earlier steps until he came to the place where the section had come loose. He paused, then he slipped through. He moved carefully, navigating the edge of the shrubbery, keeping close to the trees until he reached the spot he remembered. The vent, the one half hidden beneath a fan of ornamental grass and ground ivy. It was still there, just as before, rusted old and utterly out of place. He knelt beside it and listened. At first there was nothing but the wind brushing through the plants around him. Then, faint, barely audible, the sound returned. Humming. Not from a speaker, not from a phone, from below, from under the earth. He leaned in closer, heart pounding. The hum rose and fell like a lullaby sung by someone barely awake. Then came the cough, again wet, raspy, human. Daniel's stomach turned. He looked around quickly. Still no sign of Langford. Still no cameras that he could see. The house itself was hidden from this section of the estate, No eyes, no ears. Just him and whoever was below. He pulled out his phone and dialed. 911, what is your emergency? My name is Father Daniel Cross, he said, trying to keep his voice calm. I'm at the property of Victor Langford near the former site of St. Bridget's Chapel, just off County Route 37. Go ahead, Father. I believe someone may be underground. I found a grate and air vent of some kind. I can hear humming and coughing coming from it. There was a pause on the line. Sir, are you reporting a possible case of unlawful confinement? I don't know, but someone is definitely down there. I'm not imagining it. Are you currently on the property legally? Daniel hesitated, then sighed. No, I stepped through a damaged section of the fence. I understand I'm trespassing, but I believe this is an emergency. The dispatcher's tone softened slightly. Understood. What's your exact location? Daniel gave her the best description he could, marking nearby landmarks and the location of the broken fence. We're dispatching officers to investigate. Please wait at your vehicle unless you feel unsafe. I'll wait, Daniel said. Thank you. He ended the call, stood up, and took one last look at the vent. The humming had stopped, but the memory of it, low, mournful, undeniably human, was burned into his mind. As he made his way back toward the fence, something caught his eye. The layout of the land here had changed over the years, but he still remembered the general orientation of the chapel. The front entrance had faced east toward a massive oak tree that no longer stood. Behind it had been the prayer bench, and beneath that, nothing. No crypt, no cellar. The chapel had never had a basement. But this vent was located exactly where the sanctuary would have been. Daniel crossed himself as he squeezed through the gap in the fence once more and returned to his car. The sky had begun to dim, dusk settling over the treetops. He glanced back one last time. Then he took out his phone and dialed another number. Thomas answered on the second ring. Father, I just got off the phone with emergency services. They're sending officers to investigate. You heard it again? I did. Clearer this time. Someone's down there. There was a pause, then Thomas said, I'm coming. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Thank you, Daniel said quietly. He ended the call and sat behind the wheel, fingers wrapped around his rosary beads. He didn't pray aloud. The moment felt too raw for words. Instead, he let the silence hold him, the beads slipping through his fingers in a rhythm older than fear. Whatever lay beneath that vent, whatever had been hidden all these years, it was about to be uncovered. And nothing would ever be the same again. Father Daniel sat in his car just off the shoulder of the road, parked near the broken section of the fence. The air outside had begun to cool as the late afternoon sun sank behind the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. He didn't move much, only occasionally glancing back at the place where the vent lay hidden beneath the landscaping. His fingers traced the beads of his rosary with slow precision, his lips silently repeating prayers more out of instinct than intent. Then came the rumble of an engine. A battered red pickup truck pulled up behind his sedan. Thomas Reeves stepped out, older than Daniel remembered, but still carrying himself with quiet purpose. His plaid shirt hung loosely over jeans, and he wore a ball cap with the faded crest of St. Bridget's sewn onto the front. Father Cross, he called as he approached. I came as fast as I could. Thank you, Daniel replied, standing to meet him. You didn't have to come. Thomas waved a hand. If someone's really down there, I couldn't stay away. They exchanged a solemn nod before turning toward the woods. Police should be here any minute, Daniel added. I described the location in the vent. They'll want to speak with both of us. As if summoned by his words, the distant wail of a siren began to rise through the trees, shrill, then falling, then rising again. Within a minute, a sheriff's department cruiser appeared around the bend, lights flashing silently. It slowed and pulled in behind Thomas's truck. Two deputies emerged. One was a weathered man in his late 50s, graying at the temples and moving with calm authority. The other, younger, stood tall and sharp-eyed, taking in the surroundings with swift glances. Their badges read Sergeant Cal Monroe and Deputy Nate Leland, both from the Clatsop County Sheriff's Office. Father Daniel Cross, the older deputy asked. Yes, thank you for coming. Monroe nodded. Dispatch briefed us. You heard sounds coming from underground. I did, Daniel said, more than once. Humming, chanting, a cough. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't a radio. And this was on private land? Deputy Leland asked, eyeing the woods ahead. Daniel nodded. Technically, yes. I crossed through a damaged section of the fence. I know that's an issue. We'll deal with the legal side later. Monroe said, already stepping toward the forest edge. Right now, let's see if someone needs help. This is Thomas Reeve, Daniel added, motioning to his companion. He was the longtime caretaker of St. Bridget's Chapel before it was sold. Monroe gave him a firm handshake. Appreciate you being here. Walk us through what you found, Leland said, flipping open a small notebook. Daniel led the way through the trees toward the broken fence where he had first discovered the vent. He pointed out the section that had given way, bent metal, a loosened post embedded in soft soil. You can squeeze through here, he said. Just follow me. The deputies exchanged a glance, then nodded. One by one, the four men passed through the fence and into the landscaped clearing on Langford's estate. Daniel moved quickly but carefully, retracing his earlier steps until they arrived at the vent hidden beneath the low shrubs. There, he said, pushing the branches aside. Sergeant Monroe crouched down beside it, peering at the rusted grate with a practiced eye. Definitely old, he muttered. Pre-war, I'd guess. Doesn't match the modern landscaping at all. Deputy Leland knelt next to him, shining a flashlight through the bars. Shaft drops about 6 feet, then angles to the right. Can't see much beyond that. Listen, Daniel urged. Just be quiet for a moment. They did. All four of them stood motionless, straining to hear. At first there was only the sound of the forest leaves rustling, birds fluttering in distant branches. Then, barely above a whisper, a voice. A woman's voice. It was faint and tremulous, as if sung from the bottom of a well, but it was there, a melody. The same chant Daniel had heard in his car. Only this time there was no doubt. This was not a recording. This was not his imagination. It was a real voice, a living voice. Leland's head snapped up. Did you hear that? Salve Regina, Thomas said softly, recognition in his eyes. The ancient Marian hymn. The sisters used to sing it every night before bed. The chant faded into silence, replaced by a harsh, rattling cough. Sergeant Monroe straightened the lines on his face, tightening. Someone's down there, he said flatly, and from the sound of it, they're not well. Deputy Leland was already reaching for his radio. Dispatch, this is Leland. We have a confirmed audio contact, female voice, possible confinement in subterranean structure on Langford property, requesting immediate medical and forensic support. A crackle of static responded. Copy that, Leland. Units en route. Monroe turned to Daniel. You were right to call this in, Father. Now tell me, what is this vent doing here? Daniel looked to Thomas. There was nothing like this under the chapel when I worked here, Thomas said. No basement, no tunnels, just a flat foundation on solid earth. Then this was added later, Monroe concluded. Leland stood. Which means Langford may have built it. If so, it was never permitted, Thomas added. And I never heard of any construction approved out here after the chapel came down. Monroe turned back toward the main road. We need to talk to Langford, right now. The four men made their way back to the vehicles. Daniel felt his pulse quicken as they moved, the weight of what they had heard anchoring every step. No longer just a mystery. Now it was real. And it was alive. By the time the deputies and Father Daniel reached the road again, the weight of the discovery had settled heavily on all of them. The faint voice from beneath the earth, the unmistakable coughing, there was no longer any room for speculation. Someone was under that ground, and the only person who could possibly know how or why was the man who owned it. Sergeant Cal Monroe climbed into the front seat of the cruiser and spoke into the dispatch radio. Monroe here. Be advised we have potential unlawful confinement at the Langford estate. Requesting backup and medical units to stage nearby. Proceeding to speak with property owner now. Daniel and Thomas followed in Thomas's pickup, keeping their distance behind the cruiser as it wound along the private road that led to the main residence. Through the breaks in the trees, they caught glimpses of Langford's mansion, a sprawling, multi-tiered structure of stone and timber that seemed more fortress than home. Its windows reflected the fading light like watching eyes. The vehicles pulled into the front drive. Monroe and Leland exited the cruiser and approached the door while Daniel and Thomas remained back near the edge of the gravel. Daniel felt the tension coil in his stomach as they waited. The door didn't open. But a moment later, Victor Langford himself appeared, not from inside, but walking around the side of the house, with a large German shepherd at his side. He was dressed the same as earlier, athletic jacket, zipped high designer sneakers, expression sharp with irritation. The dog tensed as it spotted the officers pulling slightly on the leash. Langford stopped when he saw Daniel and Thomas standing in the background. His mouth drew into a scowl. What is this? He snapped, approaching the front steps. Why are they here again? I told you to leave. Sergeant Monroe stepped forward calmly. Mr. Langford, I'm Sergeant Monroe, Clatsop County Sheriff's Office. This is Deputy Leland. We're here following a welfare concern reported on your property. Langford's eyes narrowed. What kind of concern? One of our callers reported hearing what may be a human voice coming from a vent near the former site of St. Bridget's Chapel. Monroe said evenly, we'd like to ask a few questions, and if necessary, check the grounds to make sure no one's in distress. Langford's face turned red. This is absurd. You're chasing ghost stories based on some priest's fantasies. No one's accusing you of anything. Deputy Leland added, his voice calm. But we have enough reason to investigate. It could be a trespasser or someone injured. There's no one here but me and my dog, Langford growled, and you're all trespassing now. Sergeant Monroe didn't flinch. We're not entering without permission, sir, but you can help clear this up by allowing us to check the area. Langford shook his head. Absolutely not. This is private land. You don't have a warrant. Then maybe you could explain the metal grate embedded in the ground near the landscaped clearing, Leland said. The one ventilating an underground chamber. Langford's mouth opened, but no words came out. Just for a second, Daniel saw it, the flicker, the slip. Then the man's jaw set again. I installed a storm drain system when I landscaped that area, Langford snapped. What you're calling a grate is a decorative cover for runoff. That's it. Storm drain that sings Gregorian chant, Daniel called from behind the cars. Langford turned to him with a glare like a blade. Still stirring up nonsense, Father. I heard it. So did everyone else. Someone's down there. There's no one under my land, Langford snapped. And I've had enough of this. All of you off my property, or I'll have my lawyer deal with it. Monroe gave a slow nod. That's your right, Mr. Langford, but we'll be back with the proper paperwork. Langford's dog barked suddenly, pulling at the leash. I want them gone in 2 minutes. Langford snapped, then turned his back and disappeared around the side of the house, the dog trotting beside him. Monroe and Leland returned to their cruiser. Daniel and Thomas approached as the officers opened the doors. What now? Daniel asked. We get a judge, Monroe replied. This just moved into probable cause territory. He knows something's down there. Daniel nodded. He didn't even try to hide the way he tensed up. Leland tapped his notebook. He slipped. You saw it too, right? That pause. I've seen that look before, Thomas added grimly. It's the look of a man who knows he's been found out. Monroe turned toward Daniel. You two should wait somewhere nearby, but off the property. We'll keep you updated. This isn't over. Daniel hesitated. What if whoever's down there can't wait? Monroe's voice was calm but firm. We can't do anything else without a judge's signature. If we push now, he'll have grounds to block us legally. But we'll move fast. Daniel gave a tight nod and stepped back toward Thomas's truck. As they drove away, he turned in his seat and looked back at the house, still catching the glint of its windows through the trees. Langford wasn't just being hostile. He was scared, and that more than anything confirmed what Daniel already feared. Someone was indeed underground, and Langford knew exactly why. Back in the cruiser, Monroe made the call to dispatch requesting urgent contact with Judge Karen Ortega, known in the region for her level-headedness and respect for law enforcement. We'll need an emergency warrant for a welfare check, Monroe told the dispatcher. We have audio confirmation of a possible victim visual on a suspicious structure and a property owner refusing to cooperate. They continued collecting field notes, double-checking the address history of Langford's estate. Leland tapped into county archives and cross-referenced permit filings. Nothing matched the underground structure. No registered work, no excavation notice, no foundation permits. The grate was never supposed to be there. This place is hiding something, Leland said quietly, closing the laptop. And we just scratched the surface. Meanwhile, Daniel and Thomas had pulled over at a turnout on the public road, parking behind a small stand of trees. Neither man spoke for a while. The weight of what they'd heard and hadn't heard pressed down like a storm before the break. Then Daniel's phone rang. He answered immediately. Father Cross. This is Sergeant Monroe again. Good news, Judge Ortega just granted the warrant. We'll have it in hand within the hour. Daniel exhaled. Thank God. We're heading back with additional units. For now, I recommend you stay where you are. Once we breach the structure, we'll notify you. But this is now a controlled law enforcement operation. I understand, Daniel said. Just please be careful. We will. As the call ended, Thomas turned to him. You realize what this could mean? Daniel nodded slowly. Yes. After 28 years, We may finally find out what happened. But even as he spoke the words, a deep, painful truth tugged at him. What if they weren't too late? What if someone was still alive beneath that earth waiting? As the last fingers of daylight slipped behind the trees, the quiet forest around the Langford estate stirred with motion. 3 marked sheriff's vehicles rolled up the private drive with a slow, deliberate pace. Their headlights swept over the manicured grounds and the massive timber and stone residence that now loomed in silhouette. Behind the lead cruiser sat a dark van marked Clatsop County Forensics Unit, followed by a discreet white ambulance idling at the edge of the property line. Not yet needed, but waiting just in case. From the turnout where they'd parked earlier, Father Daniel and Thomas Reeve watched it all unfold, hearts pounding behind the windshield. In the passenger seat, Daniel's phone buzzed. A message from Sergeant Monroe. "We're going in now. Stand by." A moment later, a second message followed with a secure video link. Daniel tapped it open. The feed switched to Monroe's body camera, grainy, slightly fisheye, but clear enough to see the officers moving with coordinated efficiency across the gravel path. The microphone picked up snippets of barked orders, the crunch of boots, and the distant hum of wind through the pines. Deputy Lillian and 2 more officers formed up beside Monroe as they approached the front entrance. The warrant was printed, signed, and folded in a protective sleeve in Monroe's hand. The camera jostled slightly as Monroe knocked on the thick wooden door. No response. He knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Then from around the side of the house, Victor Langford appeared, just like before, emerging with his German shepherd at his side, leash coiled loosely around one hand. His face was a storm of fury the moment he laid eyes on them. "What the hell do you people think you're doing?" "Mr. Langford," Monroe said firmly, raising the paper, "we have a judicial warrant issued by Judge Karen Ortega. This is an emergency welfare check based on probable cause of unlawful confinement. We're here to search the house and any outbuildings on your property." Langford took a step forward, lips curled. "You have no right to barge in here. This is harassment." Sir Leland interjected calmly. "We're following the law. You refused access earlier. The situation escalated. We're here now with full legal authority." Langford looked at the warrant, then back at the officers. His expression changed only slightly, but Daniel, watching the stream, saw it. The shift. The fight inside the man warring with calculation. "This is a violation," Langford hissed. "I'll sue every last one of you." "You're free to pursue legal action," Monroe replied. "But right now, step aside." Langford didn't move. The dog growled low, sensing the tension. Langford's knuckles whitened around the leash. "You're not setting foot in my house," he said. "There's nothing here, I told you already. You're chasing phantoms." "Then you shouldn't mind us confirming that," Monroe said flatly. "We'll begin inside. Deputy Leland with me." Reluctantly, Langford moved aside, allowing them to pass. His eyes never left them, and his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might snap. As the officers stepped inside, the camera adjusted to the lighting. The foyer was pristine. Warm wooden floors, expensive rugs, stone archways leading into vaulted rooms. Everything gleamed. Nothing looked out of place. But Monroe wasn't interested in appearances. The camera captured them moving quickly through the main floor, living room, kitchen, home office, guest bath. Then upstairs to the bedrooms. Still nothing. No signs of distress. No hidden doors. No loose panels. Leland's voice came through the feed. "Basement's clear. Normal furnace room, no sublevels." "Copy," Monroe replied. They regrouped by the front door, Langford standing nearby like a coiled spring. "You've searched the house," Langford snapped. "You see nothing. Satisfied?" "We're not done," Monroe said. "Your property includes outbuildings and surrounding grounds. We'll proceed to those next." Langford paled slightly. "There's just a tool shed. Maintenance gear. It's a waste of your time." "Still covered under the warrant," Monroe replied. Langford said nothing, but his glare could have split wood. Back in the truck, Daniel leaned forward, gripping the dashboard. "They're getting close," he whispered. "That shed, it must be where it starts." Thomas nodded grimly, eyes fixed on the screen. On the feed, Monroe, Leland, and 2 additional officers exited the house and walked along the narrow gravel path that veered away from the main structure and into the denser part of the forest. The pines closed in tighter here. The air seemed darker, thicker. The path led to a small wooden building nestled between 2 trees. It looked unremarkable, about 20 feet square with a slightly rusted tin roof and peeling gray paint. The kind of shed you'd expect to find in any rural backyard. "This the structure you mentioned?" Monroe asked. Langford, who had followed them reluctantly, gave a tight nod. It's just a tool shed. You'll find rakes and fertilizer. That's it. The officers stepped inside. The flashlight beams illuminated the space. Gardening tools lined the walls, shovels, clippers, bags of lime and mulch. Cobwebs dangled from the corners and a musty odor hung in the air. The shed appeared untouched for months. Check the floor, Leland said. One of the officers tapped his boot against the wood. Solid. Then he moved to the opposite corner and did it again. A hollow thunk. He stopped. Tapped again. Different sound here, he said. These boards are newer. The camera zoomed in as Leland crouched and used a pry bar to loosen one of the planks. It creaked, resisted, then gave way. A square panel came up, revealing a staircase beneath. Stone, worn, descending into darkness. The officers exchanged glances. Well, Monroe said quietly, there's your storm drain. Langford stood outside the doorway, now hands shaking ever so slightly. I didn't build that, he said, but his voice cracked. You're sure? Monroe asked. Because we're about to go down there, Mr. Langford, and if there's someone beneath your property, you'd better hope they're not in danger, because then this becomes a whole different kind of case. Langford didn't answer. Monroe turned to Leland. Flashlights, tactical formation. Proceed carefully. As the officers prepared to descend into the darkness, Daniel felt his throat go dry. His eyes were locked on the screen, watching the camera angle shift toward the stone steps. Thomas's voice broke the silence. They're going in. Daniel nodded, voice barely audible. God be with them. The screen went black for half a second as Monroe entered the tunnel. Then the light returned, and what they saw confirmed every unspoken fear they'd carried for 28 long years. The stone steps were narrow, slick with years of condensation and age. As Sergeant Monroe and Deputy Leland descended, their flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing rough walls of hand-chiseled rock, reinforced with wooden beams. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the air grew thicker, damp, stale, and tinged with something harder to place decay. The staircase turned once before ending at a heavy wooden door set directly into the rock. Its hinges were iron-coated in a green patina of rust. There was no handle, just a single ancient keyhole beneath a thick metal bolt. Locked, Leland said, testing it. Mr. Langford. Monroe called back up the stairs, his voice echoing. Do you have a key to this door? Langford didn't reply. Seconds later, one of the officers from above shouted, Found something. A short scuffle followed, then footsteps descending quickly. The key was passed down a heavy wrought iron thing, clearly old. Monroe took it and slid it into the lock. It resisted at first, but with a groan and a metallic shudder, the bolt twisted and the door creaked open. What lay beyond was unlike anything any of them had expected. The tunnel extended forward, carved out of the bedrock with clear intent. The walls were uneven, but bore signs of careful shaping, scraped flat in places, smoothed in others. Wooden support beams, spaced at intervals, kept the ceiling intact, though some had splintered with time. They followed the passage for what felt like forever, though it couldn't have been more than a few hundred feet. The silence grew oppressive, broken only by their own footsteps and the distant echo of dripping water. Then light, a faint flicker bouncing against the stone. They turned a corner and entered a chamber. The flashlight beams danced across crude furnishings, a small table, a cot lined with old cloth, a wooden chair that looked handmade. The walls were covered in carvings, religious icons, crosses, scenes from scripture, all etched into the rock. Some were detailed, others just scratches. One entire section of wall had been dedicated to what appeared to be a timeline, not in numbers but in marks. Hundreds of them. Monroe's beam landed on the figure in the corner. A woman lay curled on the thin mattress, her frame emaciated, hair cropped close to the scalp, skin pale as paper. She didn't move at first. Then, as if sensing their presence, she stirred. Ma'am, Monroe said softly, lowering his light to avoid blinding her. We're here to help. My name is Sergeant Monroe. You're safe now. The woman turned her head slowly. Her eyes were sunken but alert, and in her hands she clutched a rosary handmade, strung together from what looked like fabric threads and tiny beads carved from wood. I prayed, she whispered. Her voice was raspy, barely more than breath. I never stopped praying. Monroe knelt beside her. Can you tell me your name? She hesitated, lips trembling, then formed two words. Lillian Cross. Outside, parked just beyond the property line, Father Daniel gasped aloud. In the cab beside him, Thomas went pale. Did she say? My sister. Daniel breathed, tears springing to his eyes. She's alive. The camera feed panned slowly around the chamber. On the far wall, another cot stood, this one undisturbed, draped with an old wool blanket. Beneath it, bones. A full human skeleton, partially covered by fabric, lay in the shadows. "Sergeant," came Leland's voice, quiet but firm. "We've got remains." Monroe pressed his radio. "Medical team, move in. We have a confirmed survivor and one deceased. Repeat, one survivor, one confirmed body. Immediate attention required." Upstairs, Langford, now restrained in handcuffs, stood at the tree line, surrounded by deputies. His jaw was tight, his eyes blank. But when Monroe's report crackled through the radios, he visibly flinched. "You bastard," Thomas muttered from the truck. "You locked them down there for decades." Daniel couldn't wait. He threw open the passenger door and started running, ignoring Thomas's call behind him. He reached the perimeter just as paramedics were preparing a stretcher. An officer moved to block him, but Daniel called out, "Please, Father Daniel Cross. The woman you found, she's my sister." The officer hesitated, then spoke into his radio. Seconds later, Monroe's voice returned. "Let him through." Daniel followed them down the path, through the now open shed, and into the dark passageway. The walls seemed to pulse with memory, each carved cross like a whisper of pain. When he reached the chamber, the air hit him like a stone. She was there, so thin, so fragile, but her eyes, those same blue eyes he'd known since childhood, met his. And for a moment, nothing else existed. "Lillian," he said. She tried to speak, but only mouthed the words. "I knew you'd come," he whispered, falling to his knees beside her. "I never stopped searching. I never stopped praying." A ghost of a smile crossed her lips. "I told her," she whispered at last. "I told Alma you'd find us." Monroe stepped back as the paramedics took over, carefully transferring her to the stretcher. Her rosary remained wrapped tightly in her fingers. The camera now showed Langford being placed into a cruiser, expressionless. But as the door closed, he spat toward the trees, straight in Daniel's direction. "Proud of yourself, priest," he snarled. Daniel didn't flinch. "You kept her in darkness," he said quietly. "But she never stopped believing in the light." Langford said nothing as the door shut with a final click. Back inside the tunnel, officers documented everything. Another chamber was found off the main passage, smaller, with a second set of skeletal remains presumed to be Sister Alma. The age, the clothing fragments, the carved symbols etched into the stone walls all matched Lillian's description. Back in the clearing, Daniel stood beside the ambulance as it prepared to depart. Lillian's eyes fluttered open once more as they rolled her past him. He bent low. "God never left you," he said. She smiled faintly. "He sent you." Then she closed her eyes again as the ambulance pulled away, sirens rising softly in the evening air. And for the first time in 28 years, the mystery had a name, a face, a voice. She had survived. And now she was free. The ambulance doors slammed shut and the sirens rose high and mournful, echoing into the darkening sky. Father Daniel followed in the front seat of Thomas's truck, eyes fixed ahead, knuckles white against the dashboard. He hadn't spoken since they left Langford's property. Neither had Thomas. There was nothing to say, not yet, not until the questions stopped spinning. She was alive. Lillian was alive. It didn't make sense, and yet it made every kind of sense. The voice beneath the earth, the chanting through the radio, the carved walls, the rosary made of cloth and twine, it had all pointed to this. 28 years, and she had endured. When they arrived at the hospital, the paramedics were already rushing Lillian through the emergency entrance. A nurse intercepted Daniel before he could follow. "I'm sorry, Father," she said, firm but not unkind. "We need to stabilize her first. You can't go with her right now." "I'm her brother," Daniel said, his voice rough with emotion. "Her only living family." The nurse paused, studying him for a moment. "That may be, but she's in extremely fragile condition. Please wait here. We'll update you as soon as possible." Thomas guided him gently to the nearest waiting area, a sterile hallway with plastic chairs and flickering fluorescent lights. The walls were adorned with faded posters about hand hygiene and flu season. Daniel sat clasping his hands tightly between his knees, head bowed. "She spoke your name," Thomas said quietly, as they lifted her into the ambulance. Daniel nodded. "She said she knew I'd come." They sat in silence, broken only by the occasional distant beep of hospital machines or the muffled voices of staff beyond the double doors. The minutes crawled. Eventually, Daniel's phone buzzed. It was a call from Sergeant Monroe. He answered instantly. "Sergeant, we've secured Langford in custody," Monroe said. "Transported without incident. He's not talking, refuses to answer any questions until his lawyer arrives. Daniel exhaled slowly. That doesn't surprise me. But we found something, a journal, hidden in a locked drawer in his upstairs study. Leather-bound, full of handwritten entries, dates going back decades. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. What kind of entries? You're not going to like it, Father, Monroe warned. The journal reads like the record of a man descending into obsession. It's all there, his hatred of the church, especially of nuns. He writes about watching St. Bridget's for months before the disappearances. Mentions all 4 women by name. Details their routines, their personalities. Daniel's mouth went dry. Did he say, why? There was a pause. He blames his mother, says she left him when he was a baby, ran off and later became a nun. He never knew her, was raised by a grandmother who was strict according to him. Religious discipline taken to the extreme. He writes about it with venom, describes the sisters as women who abandoned their real purpose. His words, not mine. Daniel closed his eyes. So he hated them because he saw his mother in them. Seems so. And the deeper you get into the journal, the more unhinged it becomes. After he bought the chapel, he tore it down immediately, more symbolic than practical, I think. But beneath it, he started building. First a tunnel, then those chambers. Daniel whispered he buried them alive. He drugged them first. He writes in disturbing detail about how he brought tea laced with sedatives. The older sisters fell asleep. The younger 2-year sister and the one we found deceased tried to resist. He overpowered them. Lillian fought, nearly escaped. He hit her, then drugged her too. Daniel gripped the armrest of the chair, nausea rising in his throat. He moved them at night, through a service corridor in the chapel basement, loaded them into his vehicle, burned everything, bedding, belongings, even their letters. Scrubbed the place with lye. That's why the investigators never found a trace. And the other sisters, the 2 older ones died within the first year. Their age, the stress, the confinement, it was too much. The 3rd, Alma, survived almost a decade, but she developed an infection and Langford refused to get her help. She died down there in that chamber. Daniel lowered his head into his hands. And Lillian, she was kept alone after that, separate from the others. He became fixated on her. There are entries that suggest he saw her as different, pure, untouched. Some passages are graphic, disturbing. There may have been psychological abuse, possibly physical. Daniel didn't speak. His heart thundered in his ears. She held on, Monroe said quieter now. She endured it all. She carved those walls. She marked the days. She prayed. A nurse appeared in the hallway, then clipboard in hand. Father Cross. He stood instantly. Yes. She's stable, the nurse said. Still very weak, but conscious. She's been asking for you. Daniel turned back to his phone. I have to go. Please keep me informed. You'll be the first we call, Monroe said. Thank you, Father, for not giving up. Daniel ended the call and followed the nurse down a series of white corridors, through 2 sets of automatic doors until they reached the intensive care unit. He was helped into a sterile gown, gloves, and a mask. We need to protect her from any pathogens, the nurse explained. Her immune system is severely compromised. She hasn't seen sunlight in almost 3 decades. Daniel nodded silently. Then the nurse opened the door. The room was dimmed, the lighting soft and low. Machines beeped gently in the background, tubes and IV lines snaked from the equipment to the frail body lying in the hospital bed. She looked so small. But when her eyes opened and found his, Daniel felt the breath leave his body. Lillian, he whispered, stepping closer. She smiled faintly behind the oxygen mask. Her hand moved slightly toward him, trembling. He took it gently in his gloved hand. You found me, she said, barely audible. I never stopped looking. I told Alma you would come. She believed too. I know. They were silent then, the weight of nearly 30 years pressing between them. Daniel sat beside her as the machines hummed around them. She never let go of his hand. In the corner of the room, her makeshift rosary lay beside a plastic cup of water. A nurse had placed it carefully on a tray. Daniel picked it up, studied the rough wooden beads, the knots in the string. It had been carved in darkness, crafted in solitude, prayed over for years. She had not lost her faith. She had kept it alive. He looked at her again, and she gave a soft nod as if reading his thoughts. God never left me, she whispered. And Daniel, blinking back tears, whispered, nor you him. The days that followed were unlike any Daniel Cross had known in his life as a priest or as a man. After 28 years of absence, his sister Lillian now lay just down the corridor from his hospital cot, her fragile breath monitored by machines, her skin still adjusting to air and light. Daniel remained as close as he was allowed, sometimes only able to glimpse her through a glass panel, sometimes permitted a few brief moments at her side, wrapped in sterile gear and carrying prayers he no longer needed to say aloud. She was alive. That fact in itself still felt too enormous to hold. Lillian's recovery was slow, as everyone expected it would be. The hospital team was cautious. Her immune system, suppressed for decades in near-total isolation, could be overwhelmed by a passing germ. Her body had adapted to darkness and silence, to routine and control so rigid it had nearly crushed her spirit. Coming back into the world, even a quiet hospital room, was like teaching someone to breathe again after drowning. But breathe she did. On the third morning, Daniel was allowed to sit with her for nearly half an hour. She was drowsy, drifting in and out of sleep, but she gripped his hand when he read aloud from the Psalms. Her voice was nearly a whisper, but when he stopped reading, she finished the last verse herself. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. He had to turn away briefly to hide the tears. When she slept, Daniel sat in the hospital chapel or outside on the bench beneath the trembling birch trees. He prayed not just for Lillian, but for the others who had died in that underground tomb. Sister Alma, the two elders whose names he now said softly each time he lit a candle. He imagined them sitting together again wherever they were, their voices rising in unison like the chants Lillian had hummed into the stones. Sometimes he prayed for Langford. Those prayers were different. Anger was something Daniel had always known how to wrestle with. He had counseled many through it, including himself, but nothing in his life had prepared him for the depth of cold, hard fury he felt when he thought of that man, of what he had stolen, of what he had built, of how close he had come to bearing not just lives but faith itself. And yet Lillian had survived. She had emerged, not untouched, not unscarred, but unbroken. The doctors marveled at her mental clarity. Despite physical deterioration, her memory was sharp. She remembered dates, songs, prayers, even the creaking rhythm of the chapel bell before it was torn down. She told them stories from the first year underground, how they had organized their days by prayer, how they had tried to stay hopeful, how Alma had made her laugh even when everything felt hopeless. She used to tap the pipes and make rhythms, Lillian told Daniel, once her voice hoarse. Said it was percussion for heaven. Daniel smiled. She sounds like she was brave. She was, Lillian replied. We all were, in our own way, even the old sisters. They kept saying God had a plan. Do you believe that, Turadi? Lillian didn't answer for a while. Then with her eyes closed, she whispered, I think the plan was survival. I think God gave me the strength to wait for you. Outside the hospital, the story had already reached national news. Though law enforcement tried to manage the release of details, too much had already spread: the hidden chambers, the rusted grate, the unthinkable duration of captivity. Images of Victor Langford being led away in handcuffs circulated with headline captions like, Millionaire held nun hostage for decades, and Priest's sister found alive in underground prison. Daniel ignored most of it. The press had no right to her story, not yet, maybe not ever. But what couldn't be ignored were the letters. They came by the dozen, then by the hundreds. Some addressed to him at the rectory, some to the hospital, some with no address at all, just to Sister Lillian or to the woman who survived. Children from Catholic schools sent drawings of angels and saints. Older nuns sent prayers copied by hand in careful script. Survivors of other crimes wrote their own stories, often painful and long, but ending with words like strength, hope, and miracle. Daniel read the most encouraging ones to Lillian when she was strong enough to listen. She never asked for attention. She never asked to be known. But she listened quietly, and sometimes, when the words were especially kind, she wept. Meanwhile, the investigation into Langford continued. Daniel stayed in regular contact with Sergeant Monroe, who called him every few days with updates. The journal had opened doors the team never expected, revealing not just motive and method, but names. There were people who looked the other way, Monroe said one evening over the phone. Contractors he paid in cash. A county clerk who fast-tracked demolition permits without inspecting the site. Some of them didn't know what they were helping cover up, but others, they knew enough. Will they be charged? Daniel asked. We're pursuing it. Obstruction at minimum. Maybe conspiracy. N. Langford, Tomi. Monroe's voice tightened. He still isn't talking, but we don't need him to. Between the journal, the tunnel, and Sister Lillian's testimony, we've got enough to bury him for life. Daniel didn't reply immediately. He'll never hurt anyone again, Monroe added. Daniel whispered no, but he already did. There was silence on the line. Then Monroe said, if there's anything else you need, Father, anything at all, you just say the word. By the end of the second week, Lillian was strong enough to sit upright for short periods. A physical therapist began visiting her daily, guiding her through gentle movements, raising her arms, flexing her fingers, learning to bear weight on her legs again. It was painful. Every motion left her exhausted. But she didn't complain. She would close her eyes and breathe slowly through the ache, and afterward, she would thank the therapist. You know you don't have to do that, Daniel said after one particularly grueling session. They know you're grateful. I need to say it, she replied softly. I need to remember I'm not in that room anymore. That night, Daniel sat by her bed and brought a Bible she hadn't seen in years, her own found, boxed among the few items preserved by Thomas Reeve when the chapel was closed. I kept it all this time, Daniel told her. I hope someday I'd be able to return it. She opened it carefully, her fingers trembling. Inside the front cover was her name written in the looping cursive of a much younger woman. Below it, a note in faded ink. For my brother who always believed I could serve something greater. She looked at him with tears in her eyes. I was right. Daniel smiled. So was I. By the start of the third week, the doctors began discussing next steps: nutrition, immune therapy, long-term care planning. Lillian would never return to her old life exactly as it was, but that didn't mean she couldn't have a future. The question was what she wanted that future to be. I don't know where I belong anymore, she said one afternoon. You belong wherever you choose, Daniel told her. I gave my vows in a chapel that no longer exists. I served in a world that's changed. I feel like a letter left unopened for too long. He reached across the bed, took her hand. Maybe the world's been waiting for the right time to read it. She didn't answer right away. But the next morning when the chaplain visited and asked whether she wanted to pray, Lillian sat upright and asked if she could lead. And with a trembling voice and a steady gaze, she began to speak words she hadn't said aloud in nearly 3 decades. Our Father who art in heaven. By the start of her 4th week in the hospital, Sister Lillian could stand barely. 2 nurses on either side, a walker in front, the faint tremble of her arms and legs visible with each step. But she stood. Daniel was there every day watching her fight inch by inch to reclaim something that had been denied to her. Strength, autonomy, voice. The doctors continued to monitor her vitals carefully. Her immune system had stabilized, though still fragile. Her lungs had begun to clear. Her eyes, once so painfully sensitive to light, now stayed open during daylight hours without discomfort. But it wasn't the physical changes that moved Daniel most. It was the quiet certainty returning to her voice, the way she met people's eyes again, how she sat upright in her chair and asked questions of the world, no longer hiding from it. You're healing, Daniel said one morning as they sat together in her room. Lillian nodded, sipping water slowly through a straw. I feel like I'm being thawed, bit by bit. He smiled. That's a good thing. Is it? She asked, half to herself. Because when something thaws, sometimes it breaks. Daniel leaned forward. Then let it break, and we'll build again, together. She closed her eyes briefly. They didn't all get to thaw. Alma, the others. I know. I hear them sometimes, she said, in my dreams, singing. I think it's them reminding me to speak for them. He nodded. You don't owe anyone anything. But if you choose to speak, people will listen. 2 days later, she asked for paper. The hospital staff brought her a small journal with a soft cover and a new pen. For hours, she wrote in silence, page after page, slow and careful. Daniel didn't ask to read it, but he saw the difference in her shoulders after each session, the lifting of something invisible but heavy. She wasn't exorcising ghosts. She was naming them, honoring them. That weekend, she asked to speak with the hospital chaplain in private. No one knew exactly what was said, but afterward, the chaplain arranged a small prayer service to be held in the hospital chapel on the following Sunday. Lillian didn't want media. She didn't want headlines. She didn't even want flowers. I just want candles, she said, and their names spoken out loud. The day of the service, Daniel arrived early to help arrange the small space. The chapel held only 24 seats, a simple wooden cross, and an altar covered in linen. He lit 4 tall candles, one for each of the women who had vanished: Beatrice, Joan, Mildred, and Lillian. 3 flames burned for the dead, one for the living. By noon, the room was full. Nurses, doctors, the chaplain, a few reporters allowed in, only under strict conditions, and officers from the investigation team, including Sergeant Monroe. He stood near the back, his uniform crisp, his face unreadable. When Lillian entered, aided by Daniel and a nurse, the room fell into reverent silence. She wore a pale blue hospital gown under a shawl someone had crocheted for her, a gift from a stranger. Her eyes scanned the small crowd, but she didn't flinch. She looked stronger than she had all month. She stood before the altar, her voice quiet but clear. "I was buried alive," she began, "but I was not alone." She spoke not of herself, but of the others, how Sister Joan hummed while she cooked, how Sister Mildred had arthritis in her hands but still folded them to pray every night, how Sister Beatrice told jokes to make the darkness seem smaller. She told their stories, not their ends, their lives, not just their loss. She named each of them again slowly. Then she lit the candles herself despite the tremble in her hands. And the room wept. Daniel had never seen faith so alive or grief so clean. There was no vengeance in her voice, no bitterness, just sorrow, and something stronger behind it. Resurrection. The following week, Daniel returned to Eldon Hollow alone to make preparations. Lillian had expressed a wish to return, but only once she was strong enough. There was no need to rush. The town was still reeling. Though many residents had followed the case through news updates and online threads, the return of a woman long believed dead stirred something deeper in the community, a reckoning. Not just with what had happened, but with what had been missed. People remembered odd things now. Contractors who disappeared quickly. Strange noises in the woods. The rumors that had once sounded like gossip, but now felt like cries for help no one had answered. Daniel walked through the empty sanctuary of St. Matthew's, the church where he had served for so long. It was quiet now. Dust hung in the air like suspended breath. On the altar sat a single vase with wilting white lilies left by someone anonymous. He thought of the old chapel that once stood at the forest's edge, long since demolished its ground, scraped clean by landscapers and guilt. The site would now be considered evidence, marked, surveyed, and eventually preserved, perhaps. But no physical remnants of the original St. Bridget's would return. Still, Daniel had an idea. He contacted the local bishop's office and proposed a simple monument, a stone bench with 4 names etched into it, set beneath a new tree planted in memory of what had been lost and what had been found. The bishop agreed. So did the town council. The project began quietly with no press, just a handful of volunteers, and one local mason who remembered Sister Mildred teaching him catechism. When Daniel returned to the hospital to share the news, Lillian simply nodded. "I'd like to visit," she said, "when I can walk again." "You'll do more than walk," he told her. "You'll lead us there." She smiled, one step at a time. On the day of her release, Lillian wore clothes brought by one of the nurses, a soft sweater, gray slacks, a scarf tucked at her throat. She walked slowly but unaided. Daniel stood at her side as the hospital staff gathered near the doors, clapping softly as she exited. Not out of spectacle, but out of reverence. Outside, the world smelled different, fresh, bright. She blinked hard against the light but kept her eyes open. "Everything's louder than I remember," she said. "You'll get used to it." She nodded. "I want to hear it all." The car ride back to Eldon Hollow was quiet. She watched the trees blur past the window, fingers tracing the hem of her sleeve. She looked not at the town's changes, but at the things that had remained: the steeples, the river, the old bakery with the green awning. When they arrived at the site of the new memorial, the crowd was small. Monroe stood near the edge. Thomas Reeve was there too, holding his hat to his chest. And in the center of the clearing stood the bench. It was simple, stone-smooth gray. Etched into it were 4 names: Joan Keller, Mildred Hayes, Beatrice Noma, Lillian Cross. And beneath them the words, "For those who endured, for those who never stopped believing." Lillian approached slowly, breathing in the air where the chapel once stood. Her eyes closed for a moment, then she sat. It was quiet. Then from her lips a single note. A hum. Faint, ancient, familiar. It was Salve Regina, the chant of comfort, the chant of departure, the song she'd carried into the ground and now carried back to the light. One by one, voices joined her, Daniel's first, then others. It wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't perfect, but it was whole. And in that moment, beneath the trees and the sky surrounded by a town that had lost and found Lillian Cross, became more than a survivor. She became a witness,